The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York Mariner. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York, of a good family, though not of that country, my father being a foreigner of Bremen, who settled first at Hull. He had got an estate by merchandise, and, leaving off his trade, lived afterward at York, from whence he had married my mother, whose relations were named Robinson, a very good family in that country, and for whom I was called Robinson Crutzen. But, by the usual corruption of words in England, we are now called, nay, we call ourselves, and write our name, Crusoe, and so my companions always called me. I had two elder brothers, one of which was lieutenant colonel to an English regiment of foot in Flanders, formerly commanded by the famous Colonel Lockhart, who was killed at the battle near Dunkirk against the Spaniards. What became of my second brother I never knew, any more than my father or mother did know what was become of me. Being the third son of the family, and not bred to any trade, my head began to be filled very early with rambling thoughts. My father, who was very ancient, had given me a competent share of learning as far as a house education and a country free school generally goes, and designed me for the law. But I would be satisfied with nothing but going to sea, and my inclination to this led me so strongly against the will, nay, the commands of my father, and against all the entreaties and persuasions of my mother and other friends, that there seemed to be something fatal in that propension of nature tending directly to the life of misery which was to befall me. My father, a wise and grave man, gave me serious and excellent counsel against what he foresaw was my design. He called me one morning into his chamber, where he was confined by the gout, and expostulated very warmly with me upon this subject. He asked me what reasons, more than a mere wandering inclination, I had for leaving my father's house and my native country, where I might well be introduced and had a prospect of raising my fortune by application and industry, with a life of ease and pleasure. He told me it was for men of desperate fortunes on one hand, or of aspiring superior fortunes on the other, who went abroad upon adventures to rise by enterprise and make themselves famous in undertakings of a nature out of the common road, that these things were all either too far above me or too far below me, that mine was the middle state, or what might be called the upper station of low life, which he had found by long experience was the best state in the world, the most suited to human happiness, not exposed to the miseries and hardships of labour and sufferings of the mechanic part of mankind, and not embarrassed with the pride, luxury, ambition, and envy of the upper part of mankind. He told me I might judge of the happiness of this state by this one thing, namely, that this was the state of life which all other people envied, that kings have frequently lamented the miserable consequences of being born to great things, and wish they had been placed in the middle of the two extremes, between the mean and the great, that the wise man gave his testimony to this, as the just standard of true felicity, where he prayed to have neither poverty nor riches. He bid me observe it, and I should always find that the calamities of life were shared among the upper and lower part of mankind, but that the middle station had the fewest disasters, and was not exposed to so many vicissitudes as the higher or lower parts of mankind. Nay, they were not subjected to so many distempers and uneasiness either of body or mind, as those were who were by vicious living, luxury and extravagances on one hand, or by hard labour, want and necessaries, and mean or insufficient diet on the other hand, bring distempers upon themselves by the natural consequences of their way of living, and the middle station of life was calculated for all kind of virtues and all kind of enjoyments. The peace and plenty were the handmaidens of a middle fortune. The temperance, moderation, quietness, health, society, and all agreeable diversions and all desirable pleasures were the blessings attending the middle station of life. That this way men went silently and smoothly through the world, and comfortably out of it, not embarrassed with the labours of the hand or of the head, not sold to the life of slavery for daily bread, or harassed with perplexed circumstances which robbed the soul of peace and the body of rest, not enraged with a passion of envy or secret burning lust for ambition for great things, but in easy circumstances sliding gently through the world, but sensibly tasting the sweets of living without the bitter feeling that they are happy, and learning by every day's experience to know it more sensibly. After this he pressed me earnestly, and in the most affectionate manner, not to play the young man, not to precipitate myself into miseries which nature and the station of life I was born in seemed to have provided against, that I was under no necessity of seeking my bread, that he would do well for me and endeavour to enter me fairly into the station of life which he had been just recommending to me, and that if I was not very easy and happy in the world, it must have been mere fate or fault that must hinder it, and that he should have nothing to answer for, having thus discharged his duty in warning me against measures which he knew would to be my hurt. In a word, that as he would do very kind things for me if I would stay and settle at home, as he directed, so he would not have so much hand in my misfortunes as to give me any encouragement to go away. And, to close all, he told me I had my elder brother for an example, to whom he had used the same earnest persuasions to keep him from going into the Low Country wars, but could not prevail, his young desires prompting him to run away into the army, where he was killed. And though he said he would not cease to pray for me, yet he would venture to say me that, if I did take this foolish step, God would not bless me, and I would have leisure hereafter to reflect upon having neglected his counsel when there might be none to assist in my recovery. I observed, and in this last part of his discourse, which was truly prophetic, though I suppose my father did not know it to be so himself, I say I observed the tears run down his face very plentifully, and especially when he spoke of my brother who was killed. And that was when he spoke of my having leisure to repent, and none to assist me. He was so moved by that, he broke off the discourse, and told me his heart was so full he could say no more. I was sincerely affected with this discourse, as indeed who could be otherwise, and I resolved not to think of going abroad any more, but to settle at home in according to my father's desires. But, alas, a few days it all wore off, and in short, to prevent any of my father's further inopportunities, in a few weeks after I resolved to run quite away from him. However, I did not act so hastily, neither as my first heat of resolution prompted, but I took my mother at a time when I thought her little pleasanter than ordinary, and told her that my thoughts were so entirely bent upon seeing the world that I should never to settle anything with a resolution enough to go through with it, and my father had better give me his consent than force me to go without it. That I was now 18 years old, which was too late to go apprentice to a trade or clerk to an attorney, that I was sure if I did, I should neither serve out my time, and I should certainly run away from my master before my time was out, and go to sea. And if she would speak to my father to let me go on one voyage abroad, if I came home again and did not like it, I would go no more, and I would promise by a double diligence to recover that time I had lost. This put my mother into a great passion. She told me she knew it would be to no purpose to speak to my father upon any such subject, that he knew too well what my interest to give his consent to any such thing, so much for my hurt, and that she wondered how I could think of any such thing, after such a discourse as I had with my father, and such kind and tender expressions as she knew my father had used to me, and that, in short, if I would ruin myself, there was no help for me. But I might depend I should never have their consent to it, that, for her part, she would not have so much hand in my destruction, and I should never have it to say that my mother was willing when my father was not. Though my mother refused to move it to my father, yet, as I have heard afterwards, she reported all the discourse to him, and that my father, after showing a great concern at it, said to her with a sigh, "That boy might be happy if he would stay at home, but if he goes abroad, he will be the most miserable wretch that was ever born. I can give no consent to it." It was not till almost a year after this that I broke loose, though in the meantime I continued obstinately deaf to all proposals of settling to business, and frequently expostulating with my father and mother about their being so positively determined against what they knew my inclinations prompted me to. But being one day at Hull, where I went casually and without any purpose of making an elopement at that time, but I say being there, and one of my companions being going to sea to London in his father's ship, and prompting me to go with them, with the common allurement of seafaring men, namely, that it should cost me nothing for my passage, I consulted neither father nor mother any more, nor so much as sent them word of it, but, leaving them to hear of it as they might, without asking God's blessing or my father's, without any consideration of circumstances or consequences, and in an ill hour, God knows, on the 1st of September 1651, I went on board a ship bound for London, Never any young adventures, misfortunes, I believe, began sooner, or continued longer than mine. The ship was no sooner gotten out of the Humber, but the wind began to blow, and the waves to rise in the most frightful manner, and, as I had never been to sea before, I was most inexpressibly sick in body and terrified in mind. I began now seriously to reflect upon what I had done, and how justly I was overtaken by the judgment of heaven for my wicked leaving my father's house, and abandoning my duty. All the good counsel of my parents, my father's tears, and my mother's entreaties came now fresh into my mind, and my conscience, which was not yet come to the pitch of hardness to which it had been since, reproached me with the contempt of advice, and the breach of my duty to God and my father. All the while the storm increased, and the sea, which I had never been upon before, went very high, though nothing like what I have seen many times since, no, nor like what I saw a few days after. But it was enough to affect me then, who was but a young sailor, and had never known anything of the matter. I expected every wave would have swallowed us up, and that every time the ship fell down, as I thought, in the trough or hollow of the sea, we should never rise more. And in this agony of mind, I made my vows and resolutions that if it would please God here to spare my life this one voyage, if I ever got my foot upon dry land again, I would go directly home to my father, and never set in a ship again while I lived, that I would take his advice, and never run myself into such miseries as these any more. Now I saw plainly the goodness of his observations about the middle station of life, how easy, how comfortably he had lived all his days, and never had been exposed to tempests at sea or troubles on shore, and I resolved that I would, like a true repenting prodigal, go home to my father. These ways and sober thoughts continued all the while the storm continued, and indeed some time after. But the next day the wind was abated, and the sea calmer. I began to do a little inured to it. However, I was very grave for all that day, being also a little seasick still, but towards the night the weather cleared up, the wind was quite over, and a charming fine evening followed. The sun went down perfectly clear, and rose so the next morning, and having little or no wind and a smooth sea, the sun shining upon it, the sight was, as I thought, the most delightful that ever I saw. I had slept well in the night, and was now no more seasick, but very cheerfully, looking with wonder upon the sea that was so rough and terrible the day before, and could be so calm and so pleasant in so little time after. And now, lest my good resolutions should continue, my companion, who had indeed enticed me away, comes to me. "Well, Bob," said he, clapping me on the shoulder, "how do you do after it? I warrant you were frightened, weren't you, last night, when it blew but a capful of wind?" "A capful, do you call it?" said I. "'Twas a terrible storm." "A storm, you fool you," replies he. "Do you call that a storm?" "Why, it was nothing at all. Give us but a good ship and sea room, and we think nothing of a squall of wind as that. But you're but a fresh-water sailor, Bob. Come, let us make a bowl of punch, and we'll forget all that. Do you see what charming weather it is now?" To make short of this sad part of my story, we went the old way of all sailors. The punch was made, and I was made drunk with it. And in that one night's wickedness I drowned all my repentance, all my reflections upon my past conduct, and all my resolutions for my future. In a word, as the sea was returned to its smoothness of surface and settled calmness by the abatement of that storm, so, the hurry of my thoughts being over, my fears and apprehensions of being swallowed up by the sea being forgotten, and the current of my former desires returned, I entirely forgot, and the current of my the vows and promises that I made in my distress. I found indeed some intervals of reflection, and the serious thoughts did, as it were, endeavour to return again sometimes, but I shook them off and roused myself from them as if it were a distemper, and applying myself to drinking and company, soon mastered the return of those fits, for so I called them, and I had in 5 or 6 days got as complete a victory over conscience as any young fellow that resolved not to be troubled with it could desire. But I was to have another trial for it still, and Providence, as in such cases generally it does, resolved to leave me entirely without excuse, for if I would not take this for a deliverance, the next was to be such one for the worst and most hardened wretch among us would confess both the danger and the mercy. The 6th day of our being at sea, we came into Yarmouth roads, the wind having been contrary and the weather calm. We had made it little way since the storm. Here we were obliged to come to an anchor, and here we lay. the wind continuing contrary, namely, at the southwest for 7 or 8 days, during which time a great many ships from Newcastle came into the same roads as the common harbour, where the ships might wait for the wind for the river. We had not, however, rid here so long, but we should have tidied it up the river, but that the wind blew too fresh, and after we had lain 4 or 5 days, blew very hard. However, the roads being reckoned as good as a harbour, the anchorage good, and our ground tackle very strong, our men were unconcerned, and not in the least apprehensive of danger, but spent the time in rest and mirth, after the manner of the sea. But the 8th day in the morning the wind increased, and we had all hands at work to strike our topmasts and make everything snug and close, that the ship might ride as easy as possible. By noon the sea went very high indeed, and our ship had rid forecastle in, shipped several seas, and we thought once or twice our anchor had come home, upon which our master ordered out the sheet anchor, so that we rode with 2 anchors ahead, and the cables veered out to the better end. By this time it blew a terrible storm indeed, and now I began to see terror and amazement in the faces of even the seamen themselves. The master, though vigilant in the business of preserving the ship, yet as he went in and out of his cabin by me, I could hear him softly saying several times, "Lord, be merciful to us, we shall all be lost, we shall all be undone," and the like. During these first hurries I was stupid, lying still in my cabin, which was in the steerage, and cannot describe my temper. I could ill reassume my first penitence, which I had so apparently trampled upon and hardened myself against. I thought the bitterness of death had been past, and that this would be nothing too like the first. But when the master himself came by me, as I said just now, and said we should all be lost, I was dreadfully frightened. I got up out of my cabin and looked out, but such a dismal sight I never saw. The sea went mountains high and broke upon us every 3 or 4 minutes. When I could look about, I could see nothing but distress round us. 2 ships that rid near us found we had cut their masts by the board, being deep laden, and our men cried out that a ship which rid about a mile ahead of us was foundered. 2 more ships, being driven from their anchors, were run out of the roads to sea, at all adventures, and that with not a mast standing. The light ships fared the best. There's not so much labouring in the sea, but 2 or 3 of them drove, and came close by, running us away with only their spritsail out before the wind. Towards evening the mate and boatswain begged the master of the ship to let them cut away the foremast, which he was very unwilling to, but the boatswain protesting to him that if he did not the ship would founder, he consented, and when they had cut away the foremast, the mainmast stood loose, and shook the ship so much they were obliged to cut her away also, and make a clear deck. Anyone may judge what a condition I must be in at all this, who was a young sailor, and who I had been such a fright before it but a little. But if I can express at this distance the thoughts I had about me at that time, I was in tenfold more horror of mind upon account of my former convictions, and the having returned from them to the resolutions I had wickedly taken at first, than I was at death itself. And these, added to the terror of the storm, put me in such a condition that I can no by words describe it. But the worst was not yet come yet. The storm continued with such fury that the seamen acknowledged themselves acknowledged that they had never known a worse. We had a good ship, but she was deep laden and wallowed in the sea, that the seamen every now and then cried out she would founder. It was my advantage in one respect that I did not know what they meant by founder till I inquired. However, the storm was so violent that I saw what it is not often seen, the master, the boatswain, and some others more sensible than the rest, at their prayers, and expecting every moment when the ship would go to the bottom. That has taken me to page 16. So join me next time when we follow in the adventures of Robinson Crusoe.